Hello everyone and welcome back to the Magical History Tour channel. You guys were very supportive of my last video on the best scenes from the Gettysburg movie. With over 10,000 views, it kinda blew up. A select few may have had differing opinions on gods and generals, but anyway, I still appreciate all the people who watched. So if you want to support a small but growing history channel, stick around because today we are talking about one of the most fascinating figures in American history, Thomas Jefferson. I had a request from a very special viewer of my channel to talk about Jefferson, and well, I can't help but oblige her. For you see, as a guy who's obsessed with American presidents like me, the sheer amount of contradictions in Thomas Jefferson's character fascinates me. To this day, people debate his positions on slavery, religion, and just to what extent he is considered an American hero. And as someone who I'd say has a pretty balanced view of Jefferson, cause I'm not exactly a 1619 project guy or an apologist for all that he did, I'd like to provide the most unbiased look into Jefferson that I can. We'll examine those issues like his religion and his views on slavery, but also what he accomplished as a US president and founding father. So without further ado, let's talk Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743 in the colony of Virginia. He was born to money, no doubt about it, as his father Peter Jefferson was a plantation owner and a colonial politician. Peter would die when Thomas was just 14, which would turn out to be one of many events of personal adversity that Jefferson would deal with in his life. Early on, though, it was recognized that Jefferson was a brilliant young man. A tall, socially awkward redhead, he was a polymath with many talents. He was fluent in 4 languages, English, French, Italian, and Latin, and had some knowledge of a handful of others. He was immersed in the Enlightenment ideals of his motherland of Great Britain, reading up on John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton. Needless to say, Locke would serve of great importance to him down the road. He did all this studying at William and Mary College, displaying, as they say in the 1776 movie,
a happy talent for composition.
Yes, Jefferson could write, and play the violin, but we're jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit here. In those pre-revolution days, Jefferson dealt with something that would be quite common throughout his life, a series of triumphs and tragedies. He had already lost one of his sisters while in college, writing her a beautiful epitaph in Latin. But the woman he married in 1772, Martha, has a tragic story herself. Only 2 of the 6 children she had with Thomas ultimately survived to adulthood. And 2 years earlier in 1770, most of young Thomas's family papers and books were destroyed at his old estate in Shadwell. And if you know anything about Jefferson, he could not live without his books. But it was not all doom and gloom for young Tom. He had started work on his own estate anyway, the famous and beautiful Monticello in 1768. He was admitted to the bar in Virginia, practicing as a lawyer. And because of his marriage to the very wealthy Martha, he didn't have to worry too much about losing Shadwell, because he inherited a lot more land, and people.
What can you really call a white man that really digs the, hey, cracker? Well, ruin my day. Boy, shouldn't have called me a cracker. Bringing me back to owning land and people. What a drag.
Yes, we'll address this side of Jefferson more in depth later. For you see, a revolution was brewing at this time, and the American colonies were putting their differences aside to fight the common enemy, their British overlords in the motherland. As Benjamin Franklin put it a little bit before those revolutionary days, join or die. As he also put it, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately. As someone watching a history channel, you probably know that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Undoubtedly, this is one of the achievements he is proudest of, as this bold statement on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness lives on in our American lore. We have worked closer and closer to his ideal that all men are created equal, because obviously that was not very true in 1776. It was an ideal that Jefferson was willing to risk his neck for along with the other founding fathers because, yes, while they were sick of paying high taxes, also, really, their vision was for a more democratic system than just about anywhere else in the world. They believed in individual freedom, and they did not particularly like monarchs. And you know what's next to author of the Declaration of Independence on Jefferson's epitaph? It is author of Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Let's talk about that. No matter what you may think of Thomas Jefferson's religious views, and we'll get to that, two things cannot be denied. Number one, he did not care what religion you believed in. And number two, he did not want an official state establishment of a particular religion. Does that sound familiar? If you know your constitutional law, you know that that sounds an awful lot like a certain part of the First Amendment, which states, Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Well, before America had its old constitutional convention after gaining independence, Jefferson brought that idea to Revolution-era Virginia in 1777. Now, his draft wouldn't be approved by Virginia's legislature until 1786, which just so happens to be 3 years before the Constitution was written. It took a long time for such a good idea to marinate, as around the same time, fellow Virginia Assemblyman Patrick Henry supported a more Christian government. And given the colonial ties to the Church of England, it would have been easy to make Christianity a state religion. But Jefferson's view was different. He wanted a freedom of consciousness for people, for the state to not impose any particular belief on anyone. And that, in my mind, is one of his great accomplishments. You're free to have whatever faith you'd like in America. As Jefferson put it wisely in 1813, religion is a matter between every man and his maker, in which no other, and far less the public, has a right to intervene. Now, after the Constitution was written and the flimsy Articles of Confederation were abandoned, Jefferson would serve in the cabinet of our first president, George Washington. Much like Abraham Lincoln, who'd come after him, Washington valued the opinions of people with vastly different views. Despite some Federalist leanings in terms of supporting a stronger national government, Washington remained politically independent, not tied to any party. The same could not be said of his advisors. For you see, his Secretary of State, who was Thomas Jefferson, was a hardcore Democratic Republican. That is to say, he believed strongly in individual rights and the rights of states. Meanwhile, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, had quite the opposite view. Hamilton believed in a strong national government, even to the point where he favored an elective monarchy. Yes, Hamilton, the guy we now have a famous musical about, was in favor of making George Washington a king, which of course Washington did not want. He barely wanted to be president. In any case, Jefferson and Hamilton often butted heads, leaving President Washington quite frustrated. Jefferson would continue his political career as vice president under his political rival, John Adams. As I explained in my chaotic presidential elections video, the vice president was basically whoever was in second place back in those weird days. So imagine, if you will, Kamala as president and Trump as vice president, or vice versa. That's how things were. And that made things mighty awkward between political foes. And that gets us to the 1800 presidential election, an even more bitter rematch of the 1796 contest between Adams and Jefferson. Personal insults abounded, as Jefferson was seen as a heathen atheist who had affairs with his slaves. Meanwhile, Adams was seen as a grumpy tyrant passing the unpopular Alien and Sedition Acts, which limited dissent against the US government. Obviously, the federal government flexing its muscles like this did not make Jefferson very happy, which must have meant that he was quite happy when he defeated his old friend Adams in the election. And with some political maneuvering, he got a like-minded Democratic Republican in Aaron Burr as his vice president. Now, what did Jefferson accomplish as president? A lot, as it turns out. There's a reason this man's face is on Mount Rushmore, not just for what he did in founding the country, but also in expanding it. You know, he swindled the French leader Napoleon Bonaparte with the Louisiana Purchase, getting 828,000 square miles of land for a mere $15 million. That's $340 million today, but when you consider the US added all of this, yeah, I'd say it's a bargain regardless of what Family Guy says.
Now, the man at the podium is Thomas Jefferson, and this is a very important moment. He's trying to convince Congress to approve the Louisiana Purchase.
Come on, guys. We're getting Oklahoma, Arkansas, Nebraska, Kansas, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Louisiana. What are the chances all those states suck?
Anyway, Jefferson also commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition right after the Louisiana Purchase. because if you're going to get all of this new land, you might as well explore it. He sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark out to document the geography as well as the different plants and animals that lived out in the West. Here's another impressive feat of the Lewis and Clark expedition. They set out for 862 days and had 42 men. Over the course of that trip, only one man died. And if you ever played Oregon Trail, you know that's an accomplishment. Jefferson's second term was not as successful as his first, owing largely to the unpopularity of his Embargo Act. These sanctions tried to get the British Navy to stop impressment of American soldiers, or basically forcibly conscripting them to the Brits. But the embargo failed with its intention to make Britain, as well as France, offer concessions, and all the while it hurt America at home. Exports fell, farm prices dropped, so Jefferson should have taken a lesson from Bill Clinton. It's the economy, stupid. Federalist New England protested the unpopular bill in the streets, and right as Jefferson was leaving the presidency, the embargo was repealed by Congress. Overall, Jefferson's presidency was largely a success that strengthened the country, but the embargo was definitely a stain on his legacy. But Jefferson was such a busy bee type A during his presidency that he had other things to worry about besides the political issues of his day. So he also worried about religious issues, as in 1804 he completed the Philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth, or as this would better be known, the Jefferson Bible. What was key about this here Jefferson Bible was his omission of miracles from the New Testament. Jefferson believed strongly in the moral teachings of Jesus, but as a skeptic of sorts, he did not believe as much in the supernatural. And this is where the debate about Jefferson gets quite fierce between skeptics and believers, given that having Jefferson's voice of authority on your side is probably a good thing. I'll clear up my own personal bias. I'm a skeptic of religion, and I believe Jefferson is mostly on this side. His beliefs were in line with deism, or the idea that there is a God, but also the idea that he does not really intervene in the world. They believe that the central tenet of Christianity, the Holy Trinity, is irrational. Or as Jefferson put it, to the corruptions of Christianity I am indeed opposed, but not to the precepts of Jesus himself. He also said that while there were diamonds in Jesus' wisdom, there was dung in early believers twisting Jesus to be some sort of miracle worker. However, given that Jefferson is such a complex man, there are quotes that believers will put out saying that Jefferson was indeed a pious man. Particularly at both his inaugural addresses as president, he makes references to God. He says that acknowledging and adoring and overruling providence was important. That Virginia statute of religious freedom that I mentioned earlier, well, it does begin by saying, "Whereas Almighty God hath made the mind free." Still, I think it is clear that while Jefferson definitely believed in some form of a god, he did not subscribe to the idea that Jesus performed miracles. His beliefs likely evolved throughout his long life, and as he got older he may have gotten more religious, as many people do. For example, he comforted old frenemy John Adams by saying he'll see his deceased wife Abigail again, suggesting a belief in heaven. But overall, especially for the time period he lived in, Jefferson was a religious skeptic. But as debated as Jefferson's views on religion are, his views on slavery are even more hotly discussed. But before we bring up any of his quotes or anything, let's discuss the numbers. Over the course of his lifetime, Jefferson owned about 600 slaves. As the Monticello website puts it, this man, known for declaring that all men are created equal, owned 600 human beings throughout his lifetime. Jefferson is particularly controversial for his relationship with Sally Hemings. Sally was 3/4 European, to the point where she was described as nearly white and was a favorite of Jefferson's, so much to the point where it is largely acknowledged by historians now that Sally birthed 6 of Jefferson's children. To the extent that she was coerced or perhaps even raped, again, that is up for debate. What isn't debatable, though, is that between a slave and a master that was 30 years older, there was a clear power imbalance. What we know about Sally Hemings is shrouded in mystery. Did she really like Jefferson? We'll never know. But it's a bit of an icky question to ponder considering just how hypocritical Jefferson's views on slavery seem to be. Now, I hate to use a comedy sort of channel as a source here, but I'll let Epic Rap Battles of History's portrayal of Thomas Jefferson do some talking.
I participated in a broken system that I hated, but I needed to keep my financial status situated. And the words I used were a hideous blot to describe the slave trade and the pain it hath brought.
And he didn't just call it a hideous blot, he called it a moral depravity. Like many other of the Southern founding fathers, he believed that slavery should be phased out. The thing was, not in his lifetime. And this punting and punting down the road, as you may know, helped lead to the Civil War. We'll circle back to Epic Rap Battles of History real quick just to see what his foe, Frederick Douglass, has to say about his views on slavery.
You talk about freedom, but you ain't applying shit!
Indeed, while Jefferson did not like slavery, he felt he had justifications to keep his slaves. He was worried about his finances, he didn't want to create civil unrest between freed slaves and their former masters, but the fact of the matter is, Jefferson said one thing and did something else when it came to slavery. So to me, his legacy on the topic is, at best, a complicated one. Now, I only alluded to the post-presidency life of Jefferson. This was essentially retiring to Monticello and staying up to date on his various hobbies and interests, which were plentiful. But of course, what's particularly known about his post-presidency life is rekindling his friendship with John Adams. Abigail Adams was important in getting these two to be bros again, considering her close relationship not only with her husband, but also Jefferson himself. She wanted the two to be friends, seeing as Abigail called Jefferson one of the choice ones of the earth. Adams and Jefferson were pen pals for their elderly life, Jefferson living until 83, Adams living until 90. An impressive lifespan now, but even more so given the time period. Adams's final words on his deathbed on July 4th, 1826, 50 years after independence, were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." In fact, Jefferson had died a few hours prior. And now, nearly 200 years removed from Jefferson's death, what should his legacy be? In my humble opinion, it's a mostly positive legacy that is marred a bit by his hypocrisy on slavery. First, we should remember his commitment to a democratic form of government. Well, a system of democracy that was at least very democratic for its time period. One must put into historical context what Jefferson's accomplishments were for the time. Secondly, we should remember Jefferson not just as someone with skeptical and maybe even conflicting views on religion, but clearly as someone who promoted religious tolerance. His words basically made up the Establishment Clause of our First Amendment to the Constitution. Third, we should remember him as an accomplished president who doubled the size of America's land, then sent out a successful expedition to explore said land. But finally, we should remember that his ideal that all men are created equal was something he clearly did not live up to over the course of his lifetime, nor did he really try. I am willing to put into historical context his creating what was the most democratic form of government to that point in history, but less generous when it comes to slavery. Those who may be a bit of an apologist would say that remember, slavery was common back then. Plenty of other people in America owned slaves. But I question why Jefferson did not live up to the principles he so espoused. In any case, Thomas Jefferson is a complicated man, and I'm sure some of you may have different opinions of him than me. So let me know in the comments, and I'll see you again hopefully soon. Bye bye.